All right, hello again. Here is a quick tutorial, sort of a refresher for myself, but also there was a discussion or an interest in collecting or retrieving some information from the rendering in PuppyRay. There are not many options with that. The question was whether you could retrieve something like the diffuse channel, the specular, I don't know, ambient occlusion, a variety of things that you might occasionally need for some extra rendering or post-processing or other reasons. And we don't do that currently in PuppyRay, except for one thing, which is the Zbuffer, the depth information. And when you look at this picture, this is sort of what you could do with it. When you look in detail, these trees are all the same. It's actually just one image, but with some random hue and random size and random a couple of other things once I converted it to a custom brush. But most importantly, it's also changing the size based on the distance. So you can quite easily paint it. And you notice back here, there's some small ones back there. And then as we get closer, they get bigger. And so that sort of control is something you can have automated with the feature down here in the sidebar at the very bottom where the grids are. Right? If you look on the grids, open that up, there's an option called Z Scale Guide. There's the other things like the artist guides, there's some visible grids, there's a couple of other options, but the Z-scale guide is essentially using a grayscale image from the swap image, right, in the swap buffer. And if I switch to the swap image, you can see right now I have this thing here, which essentially affects, by enabling the Z-scale, this will affect the size of your brush. If you have a custom brush and you enable this as you're using the brush, in fact, let me do that. So right now I'm going to pick this brush and I'm going to enable it so I can see it. It's not affected right now, right? But if I go to this and I switch this back to the swap image, now you see the brush is changing in size based on what the swap image contains. So I can paint over this image here. For instance, this might be the original rendering like that. And I want the brush to change in size based on, well, in this case, based on the depth, on the distance, right? So that depth distance is something that the PuppyRay can actually render. And we can collect that in order to then transfer it into this swap image. Now, so whatever is in the swap image will affect the size of the brush based on enabling this here, right, the Z-scale guide. All right, so how do I get this into the swap image in the first place? How do I produce this and how do I get that into the swap image? So essentially when I started, let's go turn this off for a second here, preview off. When I started, I had this image here in as the height map, and you noticed I did intentionally make it go from black to white, bottom to top. So the height map, even though there's also some erosion and some mountain scenes, in a nutshell, it was created with something like this here. I render to plasma noise. Maybe in just plain opaque mode, and then oh yeah, that was it. And then I go to the to the gradient, linear gradient, and make it something like this, black to white in multiply mode, right? So that's important. The mode here has to be multiply. Then that way, you know, you're going to be very dark, low elevation in the front, at the bottom there, and possibly high elevation at the top. I mean, another way to do that is simply from a white go like this, right? So you have a gradient of elevation, and if you put that into the swap image, you know that if you enable the Z-scale and you enable viewing the brush, now you see that brush image go like that. Now, if this at the bottom is representing nearby, you need to have it inverted. It needs to be bigger trees up close and smaller when they are farther away. Well, that's easily done. You just invert this image, right? So you invert there, right? So now you switch it back, and now indeed they're small far away and they get bigger close. Now, how fast that transition is happening, that's something you affect or you control simply by looking at maybe the filter and adjusting the contrast. You could also use the curves filter, and right, something like this here will make it drop faster. This will make it go slower. You can do a linear transition, just keeping it that way. Maybe something like this might be more interesting. And so now they stay small for a longer time until they suddenly jump up a little bit bigger. So there's a couple of ways to affect that. But how do I get this from a 3D rendering in the first place? Okay, so I'm going to start with this, and then perhaps also have the coloration here. That was the color map coming from the 3D designer. And so now I want to render that in Puppy Ray. And let me disable the brush and go here. I'm going to go to Transform Puppy Ray GPU. And so the question is, when I render this, let's first go into without anti-aliasing. What you want to do is look for the part that is the lowest elevation. I'm right by the wall here, right? So initially you're probably not just there. So what you could do, you might possibly be up higher and above the mountain. There you go. And so what I'll do is I'll just look for that and make sure that I'm really close to that edge. Something like this. Maybe go forward a little bit more. There you go. And then go down. Make sure I don't disappear in the mountain like that. Right? Stay close, but not too close. And then you can turn your head to the side and rotate. And that will give you a good idea of, a good view of something like this. Right? So here we have, too far. There you go. Here we have a nice elevation going up. And gradually going up to the highest peaks, but in the front we know it's very low elevation, right? And so that's where we can do it's actually not so much the elevation, it's the distance we're looking for, right? We want to have the Z depth information contain the distance of these pixels as they're being rendered out there. So let's say I'm rendering this. Maybe even with some water. Let's go back to enabling the water. Let's see what that looks like. No, that's too much. I think I need to have the camera up above the water. There you go. And have the water level down perhaps. Or have the ground come up. There you go. That could be interesting. I don't know if the water plane is going to contribute to that. To the Z distance. Let's try one without first, and then we'll do another one with. Okay, so that'll be another tutorial. This one here we'll do without the water and render it. And we can do this with better quality if we need it, but the focus is really on the Zbuffer, so we don't really need the super high quality. Let's just do 22 levels of anti-aliasing and then render that. But how do we collect the Zbuffer? So before you render, you want to go to the World tab and click that Z here. It's supposed to be a toggle, but I can't really say whether it's toggling or if it's actually the act of clicking that will collect it into the Zbuffer. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe when I click it, boom, it copies the Z depth information. Because I've already rendered something. It has something in the Zbuffer. So maybe I got it wrong as to what this actually does. Because I don't see a toggle change here. I don't see it go brighter or dark or boldface or anything like that. Maybe this just simply, whatever the Zbuffer contains, copies it to the alpha. You know what? I'll try that. Let's go do this. Let's not render it again. So I'm going to go and empty that, and I'm going to go back into first I'll go to the selection mask, selection on. So right now, no depth information visible there. I'm going to go clear this and then go back to the filter. We go right here, puppy ray. And so we don't do the rendering. We'll just go, and we are still in the world tab here. I'm going to click this. Click this, call it done, and then see the selection on. Yeah, nothing there really. Let's store that selection. Store selection, there it is. Yeah, it's plain white all over. All right, so now what we'll do instead, let's go clear that. Let's go transform like this. And then this time, so yeah, I don't know if I need to just click it first and then render. Let's go do that. And we're done. And now store the selection. Now we do have something there. So now we have what was rendered into the alpha channel, right? And we can tell it's brighter the farther away it is, and then the sky is very bright. That's infinitely far away. That's the brightest level. And then here we have some grayscale values, and they get darker and darker. And so here it's going to be where we may need to adjust that somewhat, right? So that's the image that's in the swap. And if we enable selection on, there you go. You can see the tinting because I have selection overlay enabled, right? And you can also see the marching ants. That's showing you where the 50% demarcation line is. This is between non-selected and fully selected, or opaque or transparent, right? So at that point, it's a matter of adjusting that. Now you could do the selection adjust right here. You could adjust selection, right? And then you can adjust the value, give it some amount. There you go. So there's a variety of levels or controls for that. One that I prefer is perhaps to take that into an image like a grayscale, like you see it in the preview, right? This preview here, but I want to invert it. Actually, we could do that here. We could invert it. So now we have the grayscale, but in the other direction. So bright up close. And we'll need that if we want that to indeed control the size of the brush, like for those trees. So bright will make it bigger, and the farther away they are, it's going to be smaller trees. But these may still be too big here, so we need to adjust that so it's not quite that bright in the far distance here. We need to go darker a little bit faster. So how to do that? Well, we have it in the selection mask. In fact, here we have it just in the stored copy. Let's set that. Let's replace the selection mask. So now we have it in here. And we can copy or transfer a selection here from the image. That's the alpha, and we can copy the selection to the swap image. Right? So when we do that, we now have this grayscale image that I also see in the stored copy here, but it's here in the selection, and now it's also in the swap image. If I switch back to the swap, you can see it right there. Right, so now that we can store as an image, we can use this little shortcut. So we have a snapshot here. This one has both the alpha channel and this grayscale image stored. The important thing we really care about is the grayscale image. We can clear the alpha, which happens to have the same information, but at this point we really are going to work with it as a grayscale image. And so here we want to make it a little bit darker, farther away. In fact, if you look at this and you can recognize some of the mountain peaks and you say, I don't want any trees on them, what you could do is actually paint over that, or at least use something like a grayscale gradient like we had before here, and use it in multiply mode and prevent any trees by making them 0 size here. I mean, this is going to be a scale, a depth mask that's going to be used for scaling, so we can use it like this, and none of the trees will appear over the peaks in the back there because they'll be scaled down to 0 size. You can make it much more sophisticated. You can paint this in a couple of ways, and so that way you have pretty good control over how big those trees will actually appear. All right, so with that in mind, we can now switch this back, and we have still the rendering that coincides with the depth information that we have modified a little bit. If we didn't modify it, we would have perhaps too many trees in the far distance. And this way here, we can adjust that a little bit, right? And so now it's just a matter of going back to the scale is enabled. That's the lower right corner here. We have this Z-scale guide, and we can go to the brush tool, and we can enable the brush, and we can pick one of those stored brushes, and maybe the size, maybe the opacity. If it's not appearing initially, it might be, you may want to double check that the size is good, but yep, this is all good. And you can see now the brushes are appearing in different sizes. And there's a few other things I did to make them appear even more different from one to the other, because you want some variety with these trees. So look at the settings for the brush, and pin this down here. There's a couple of random things you want. You want the random position, so it's not only exactly where you have it on your, as you're painting. You don't want it exactly there. You want to kind of randomly dabble around. So that would be this with the random position. Another thing you could do is the random size. So they also change a little bit in appearance simply by their size. And then one that's also quite effective is the hue. You want slightly more red or more green or less blue, some random changes on the hue and random changes on the saturation and the random changes on the value, right, to make them darker or brighter. Experiment with these. You'll find a good spot where it's not too much but not too little. And that way you can, in the preview, you don't see as it's changing, at least not yet. Maybe that's a feature request for a future enhancement, where as you're moving around, it's already showing some randomness there. But certainly you can now, as you're painting, you can see how it's changing the size the farther away you are, and then you simply paint from the front, from the back there to the front, and they get bigger and they go through different changes. Now, this is a bit of a messy blob, or a blobby mess, and I'm going to go and pick some areas where I want some trees, run some back there, paint them from the back, and then gradually come to the front, leave a few spots open, and then perhaps have a few here. Now, these trees are still too close together, so let's undo that a little bit. I want a little bit more sparsity there. Actually, I'm going to take another one here. This one here has also one thing I added to it is a little bit of a drop shadow. It has a little drop that was done here with the brush. Add a drop shadow, and that gives it a little bit additional, a little bit of surrounding darkness, or almost like a ambient occlusion shadow or diffusion or something like that. So it gives it a little bit more presence that might be good to blend it in with some of these. So now I'm going to go here, perhaps add a little bit more on the random position, and especially on the step, the distance here. They're too close together, so I want more sparsity, and that's how you do that. Let's make sure we close that. There you go. Yeah, still too close together. Let's make it really sparse there. There you go. So now I can paint around here, paint another dab here, paint here, and then occasionally you'll want to have a few that are very far away, and just single dabs, right? You can go here to this thing here and do a single click here, another one here, and maybe without the random size, so you can control better how big these are up front. But anyway, that's the idea with setting up this Z-scale guide, using this Z-scale guide. And before you can use that, you'll want to have this depth information. And if you can't get it done from if you forgot to do that from the rendering, you can still create one yourself manually, right? I mean, after all, the Z-scale guide is what's really enabling it. What you need is a grayscale, sort of a gradient, a transition that somewhat mimics the information that you have on the rendering side, right? So if you have something like this here, all you need is a grayscale that says starts about here, it's black, so it's above it, it's not going to have any drawing. The brush is going to be 0 size, and then up here you'll want it to the max. So in fact, you can do that. You can switch to the swap image. Initially, you might clear it, and then you can blend to see them both. Right, click in the upper right corner. Yeah, here on the sidebar, you have the 3 icons: the current brush image, the current paper texture, and then also, and you can right-click that to see. Or you can't, yeah. You can see different options there, but most importantly, you can enable blending the two. Here you have the swap image you're looking at, and here you're in blended mode where you see them both together, right? But you're still looking at the swap image, right? The swap image is currently blended with in a multiply mode, or default. The multiply is the same for this. And so what you can do is you can see actually the underlying main image while you're painting, or for instance adjusting the gradient here, and say something like something like this, and then that way you have the gradient that you needed, and you can see as a reference initially. You can put this reference here with the gradient. You can see it at the same time as the underlying image, but you're not actually destroying the underlying image. That one is in the main image. When you switch back to it, you still see it, and you can undo this blending mode. But now you know that in the swap image, you have this gradient that matches the layout and the topography of the background image over which you want to paint your trees. All right, well, I hope that clarifies it. Have some fun with this. It all goes back to just this one little feature here. You need to have, under the transform and PuppyRay GPU, you need to select this little button here, Z, to collect the Z information. And then when you render, it will have rendered in your Zbuffer, it will have rendered the distance information, and it copies that actually to the alpha channel, right? So you can actually immediately see it if you want to, right here from the selection menu. Go turn the selection on off. Oh, and it didn't do it, and the reason is that I had it already on, and when I clicked on the Z, I turned it off. I think that's a little shortfall here, a little bug. We need to make it more visible. Let's go make it clear here. Transform, PuppyRay. What we really need here is under the World tab. This thing here is not highlighted well enough to tell me if it's actually enabled or not. So I need to click it. This time I think I will have it. Let's go render that. Ooh, what happened now? I did not have the right information in the buffer there, did I? Oh, am I still doing blending? No, no blending there. Oh, it's the swap image. The swap image is all black and, of course, or very dark, and that's going to be the texturing on it. So it's going to close. Let me get rid of that. There you go. Yeah, got too many things interacting here for a quick and easy demo. So we have the main image here. We have nothing in the background. And actually, this is really what should be in the background. And this is what should be in the main image. And now we go and render one more time. Z, I clicked it. Let's leave it. Let's render this. And I think this time I should see. There you go. Now we got it. Okay, so the Z, the depth information, got copied, got placed into the alpha channel or the selection mask. And from there, you can take it into a couple of places. First thing I will do is perhaps save store a selection, so you have a copy of that. Then perhaps invert it right here in the stored copy and replace it, so you now have actually the inverted selection. It's not the only way to do it. Of course, you can also do that directly from the selection mask. Here, invert selection. Right? You can go and invert the selection. You can adjust the selection. You can do a couple of other things that might be useful with regard to that grayscale image that you want. And if you really want to see it as a grayscale image, the next better thing is to actually copy the alpha into the swap image. So now you can switch over to the swap image. You can clear the selection, and you're looking at the grayscale image of what was that selection mask, the Zbuffer depth. Now, it's only 8-bit in depth, so it's not as detailed as what was actually used in the rendering pipeline, right? So that is a little shortcoming there. You will have a bit of a blockiness to it, or sort of not very high amount of detail on this. In the front here, though, it's quite perhaps a bit more detailed, and you have probably more control there to adjust a little bit some more, right? So you could certainly still go to the transform, to the adjust filter, for instance, with the curves, and do a little bit more. Yeah, no, even there, it's white. It's all white here, and that's just a little bit perhaps some of the limitations of this. You don't have a very high level of granularity on it. But in some cases like these, you might be better off just doing your grayscale gradient yourself. But in some other cases, you might find it a good time saver to actually collect that Zbuffer information. All right, well, that's it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.